Hello, everybody at home. Thanks for tuning in to Poetry Night. I'm Nicole, the manager at It Again Bookstore, and I'm joined by poets Kiki Petrosino and Jason Schneiderman. Both Kiki and Jason have new books that just came out in May. Kiki's is White Blood, A Lyric of Virginia, and Jason's is Hold Me Tight. If you want to purchase either their new books or any of the rest of their works, we encourage you to check out either your local bookstore or follow the links in the comments back to our website. The way the formatting is going to work tonight, each poet will read for a total of 15 minutes, but they're going to be alternating, switching back and forth. And then after they're through with their readings, we'll have a discussion on craft. Viewers, feel free to make comments or ask questions throughout, and we'll respond to them at the end of the readings. Since they're alternating, I'll introduce both poets to begin with. So Kiki Petrosino is the author of 4 books of poetry: White Blood, A Lyric of Virginia, published just in May 2020, Witch Wife, published in 2017, Hymn for the Black Terrific in 2013, and Fort Red Border, published in 2009, all from Sarabande Books. She holds graduate degrees from the University of Chicago and the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. Her poems and essays have appeared in Poetry, Best American Poetry, The Nation, The New York Times, Fence, Golf Course, Jubilat, Tin House, and online at Ploughshares. She teaches at the University of Virginia as a professor of poetry. Petrosino is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize, a fellowship in creative writing from the National Endowment for the Arts, and an Al Smith Fellowship Award from the Kentucky Arts Council. And Jason Schneiderman is the author also of 4 books of poetry: Hold Me Tight in 2020, Primary Source from 2016, Striking Service from 2010, and Sublimation Point from 2004. He edited the anthology Queer, a reader for writers from the Oxford University Press in 2016, and his poetry and essays have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including American Poetry Review, The Best American Poetry, Poetry London, Grand Street, and the Penguin Book of the Sonnet. He's an associate professor of English at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, CUNY, and lives in Brooklyn with his husband, Michael Broder, and teaches in the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. All right, I believe, Kiki, you're going to go first.
Well, thank you so much to everybody at Read It Again, and thank you, Jason, for agreeing to read with me. I'm just going to put my cup of tea right here. Maybe I'll put it outside the frame. So what Jason and I are going to do is probably read maybe two or three pieces, and then we'll switch off, and hopefully through that method you'll be able to see and hear how the poems of 2 really different poets could still be in conversation with one another. This book that I'm going to read to you from, my new book, is called White Blood, A Lyric of Virginia. And this book discusses history, genealogy, and the legacies of slavery and racial discrimination in Virginia, which is where my ancestors were part of the free and enslaved community. The first poem is Prelude. You are on a train, and your ancestors are in the quiet car. The quiet car is locked with a password you can't decrypt. You're a professional password decryptor, but your ancestors are demolition experts. You're wearing black tactical gear, and your ancestors are wearing black tactical gear. You're dashing through each compartment, slamming doors open, while your ancestors lay small explosives. As heat expands within the carriage, you escape through a picture window. You climb to the top of the train, and your ancestors rappel down the sides. You're rappelling down one side of the train when you glimpse your ancestors above you. They leap from carriage to carriage as if weightless, as if drifting, as if curling tongues of snow. You cling to the side of the train as each of your ancestors lifts away from you. They float into the cloud of themselves. In the rushing light, you perceive them as hundreds of slow snake doctors. Oh, you begin. Instructions for time travel. You must go through Mr. Jefferson, along his row of chinaberry trees, behind the ruined smokehouse, in unmarked tracts, under field stones, with no carvings, no monuments, with a few leaves shadowing the mulch, near scattered weeds in sunken lines, while the sun walks in the day, at the end of the day, in an oval of brushed earth just as the soft path finishes under branches where the dead are always saying what they always say, right about me. Over to you, Jason.
So I'm going to read in response to the first poem. Actually, this is from my first book. Oh, that's what I used to look like. My first book. This poem is called Ancestry. How can I tell you that my ancestors are soap, that I'm descended from soap? And every morning in the shower, they melt in my hands and run from my body. And that as hard as I've tried, there's nothing to hold on to, nothing that won't rub away. And I'm going to get to this book now, the new book. And I'm actually going to read a fairly long poem from the first section. And so, Kiki, you'll have to read a long poem to sort of keep the rhythm going. Anger. When I was angry, I kept asking how anger works. No one understood my question. Friends thought I was joking or being obtuse. Friends would say, what do you mean how anger works? Anger is anger. What are you asking? And I would say, well, is anger a finite material? Is anger like hydrogen? And there's simply a certain amount of it in the universe. Is there a zero sum of anger? A law of the conservation of anger? And can we pass it back and forth? Can you take my anger and leave me less? Can I take your anger and then have more? Is anger a renewable resource, like trees or coral reefs, subject to natural rhythms and mass die-offs, forest fires and warming tides, cycles of growth and depletion? Is anger something you deplete like money, that you save or spend and is gone as it goes, or something replenished like ejaculate, more on the way as soon as you send some off? Or is anger like ova, each egg coming on its own schedule until they run out? Is anger like pus, a response to a wound that you can drain or that you can heal? Or is anger like a gas you can vent because it is compressible but combustible? Or is anger like water that will explode the water balloon unless you tie it off at the right time? I thought someone had to know the answer because I was consumed by anger. It was under everything I did. I felt it all the time, and it never departed. I didn't have a breakdown, though I asked friends if what I was experiencing was a breakdown. No, they said, a breakdown looks only like a breakdown. And I looked okay, but no one knew how to help me. And I told a friend that I wasn't okay. And she told me that I was okay, but the anger was there all the time, like a pair of shoes. They were always between me and the ground I walked on. And I kept asking everyone how anger works. Can you drain it? Can you vent it? Can you stop it? Can you heal it? Can you trade it? Can you sell it? And no one knew what I was asking until finally someone asked me to describe what I was feeling. And she said, "You're not talking about anger. You're talking about rage." And I realized that I've never experienced anger. I've only known rage, which helped a lot, which explained why I could only think about striking out and then not strike out, which explained why I knew which plants in my garden could be made into poisons and how, which explained why my daydreams turned into elaborate fantasies about harming people until I did the things I imagined to myself. And listen, please, listen, I knew it was bad and I wanted out, but I couldn't write my way out of it. And I couldn't think my way out of it. And I couldn't love my way out of it. And I couldn't read my way out of it. And I thought I would live with it forever, that I would contain it at whatever price I had to pay. And I'm telling you this, and I need you to listen because I'm saying that I do understand what it's like to want everyone else to suffer as much as you are suffering. And I understand what it's like to want to die, both to contain the pain of rage and to spread the pain of rage. And when you read of this mass murder or that suicide bombing, know these killers are not inhuman or monstrous, but rather they are weak vessels for rage. They are balloons that have burst with their rage. They are pipe bombs made of flesh and bone, and peace is what I want more than anything else. But peace is so fragile, so easy to take, so easy to lose, that they take it from you to feel less alone. And I'm out of it now because I thought I had done it to myself, but I didn't. I see that now. I'm closer to peace. I'm further from rage. I'm a bomb, no longer ticking, but I was a bomb. Hold me tight. I was a bomb. Hold me tight. Back to you, Kiki.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to respond both to the idea of a longer poem and this idea of rage and not knowing where one is on the spectrum between anger and rage. This is a sonnet crown that I wrote called Happiness, which is you'd think would be the opposite of rage, but I was thinking about Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson's writings, particularly when he talked about the pursuit of happiness and how really happiness in that formulation had to do with economic happiness, economic wealth and prosperity, which of course was generated in the early days of the United States through the exploitation of the labor of enslaved people, some of whom are my ancestors. So I'm going to read several sections of this sonnet crown. A double sonnet crown is 15 sonnets that are all linked. The last line of sonnet 1 becomes the first line of sonnet 2, and it goes like that in a chain. Happiness. 1. In. I got in. That is, inland, to the inmost place. My university. Blue ink on the letterhead, orange slit in my thumb, in the innards of each finger pad so deep you cannot prize me out of my acceptance. How I prize the letter they let me in with into that indwelling spot where I grew like a braid in bad light in some bind, honors of honor, my crown grew all season, circlet of torches blooming on the hill. Blooming across hills, I was a girl of blooming sense, of slip and colored sedge, a floret. The stem of my neck spiked up from my lanyard, my head leaned and looped sunward. Back then, my body filled a chair, plant body, water body, back then in that weedy way, seed girl, scholarship girl, but I didn't feel it, didn't yet sense myself turning into sedge grass, spiraling from the root, blade upon blade upon blade. Blade upon blade upon blade, a cavalier grows. In here, a colonnade, clink of goblets. The cavalier loves her universe, slashes, shadowed stripes. She looks center right or center justified. She seeks that middle note some never reach, white heart of the page, where distinguished men appear in battalions of charm. They will not speak to thee. How to write with only thick white ink and not be thought a cheat. We think and think, we think and think and think. To think of those white kids whose turn some said I took. I took it hard. My turn, my breath, my package of aid. I made a massive shape, mid-traipse across the lawn or hunched at lunch. I ate the beautiful books I bought with borrowed funds and swallowed down that two-ness one ever feels. My body's debt, silent slab. I knew I was a living lab. Since I was a living lab, I scythed skull clean my crop of hair. I buttoned up my button-downs like tarps and hummed in botanical Latin the notes of my glasshouse erudition. Now, I can't stop counting these dents in my ribs, system of stinging whorls, tiny rosettes, stelled in my side, for I leaned so long against that trellis. What I took for petals were scars. What I took for petals were scars. What I thought was Jefferson Park Avenue. At 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, what I thought was just Tuesday was my grandfather in Brooklyn looping the cord about his neck, testing its clear tensile metal before he hanged himself. What happens when the beloved body hangs up its flowers? Every flower falls over the top of the door. At the choir leader's door, I hung, offering guests chilled shrimp bites, woodsy darts of rosemary. I waited with the tray she'd given me and peered back through her faculty pavilion. Arrangement of deepening grids, silver, silver, silk. One whole chamber just for books. With my eyes, I robbed it bare. No one saw me chomp the chandelier. It went down a carnival onion. My jaws grew, salt, sharp, and strange. Let my jaws be his salt shovels. Let my eyes be his cannonball clock. Let my feet be the dark birds he keeps in a cloud. Make my chest his china berries, their medicinal ring. Make of my side his smokehouse smell, and my arms his lettuce dipped in French light. Turn my scalp blue from the smoke of his fires. My debts at lunch, let them be his glass doors. Turn my neck into his turning buffet. Ain't my breath his dumbwaiter loaded with wine? Ain't my thoughts his nail rod, his ice house, his pond? Look at my skin, nearly shell-edged. Oh, still, this rattle, my heart, bone dominoes at night, this rasp in my heart, red leather, his swiveling throne. Back to Jason.
I love that crowd. That crowd's fantastic. So I'm going to read, I have a sequence of poems about wolves. And so this is my sort of poem for the people in between, or people who don't feel either here or there. Little Red Riding Wolf. On the lecture circuit, Little Red Riding Wolf is generally brought to tears by at least one question. Wolves tend to accuse her of being a collaborator, while humans tend to demand to know if she has ever eaten a person herself. Folklorists tend to dismiss her outright as being trapped in a very stupid story, while a certain cadre of literary theorists consider her very identity an Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail, a figure that they hope will become as popular as the rhizome once became for an earlier generation of scholars. None of this helps Little Red Riding Wolf, whose only real pleasure is cruising online dating apps, never meeting up, but pretending sometimes to be only a wolf, and sometimes to be only a little girl. And here's a poem about storytelling, Little Red Riding Hood Season 12. You would think people would get tired of it by now. The way the wolf dies at the end of every season, but turns out not to have died. And certainly fans point out that the Joker never dies in the Batman comics, that Blofeld is always on his way back to battle James Bond. And if anything, the complaint that gains the most traction is not that the wolf should meet a singular fate like Circe or Moriarty, even though he had his own tendency to come back, but rather at how much more extreme the peril that Little Red is placed in at the end of each season. In season 8, the use of medieval torture devices was extremely upsetting. Several parenting organizations boycotted the show after the suggestion that Little Red had been experiencing flashbacks in season 10 and that there had been no wolf at all, only her fears and trauma. I found season 11 the hardest to take and more or less stopped watching after Little Red was doused in gasoline and sobbed while the wolf flicked lit matches at her and the two corrupt cops in league with the wolf explained to her how they would cover it up. The bathtub scene in season 12 didn't entirely surprise me, but still, that happened to someone I know. And I won't be watching season 13 when they've promised to finally kill the wolf and fill him full of stones. Because even if they keep their promise, there'll be another season as long as there are viewers. That's how stories work, how they keep getting told over and over and over, as long as people will listen. Back to you.
Thanks, Jason. This is The Shop at Monticello. I am a black body in this commonwealth, which turned black bodies into money. Now I have money to spend on little trinkets to remind me of this fact. I'm a money machine, and my body constitutes the commonwealth. I spend and spend in order to support this. I support this mountain with my black money, strange mountain in late bloom, strange mansion built on mountains of wealth. I spend so much, I'm late for the sign. I look good in the dome room prowling its high gloss floor. It's common to desire such flooring for my own home, but owning a home is still strange. My blackness makes strange tools for a living, rakes the strangeness like dirt. I like to rake my hands over merchandise, bayberry votives, English hyssop in crisp sachets. I like this engraved pewter bookmark so much suddenly I line up for it, clenching my upright fist. I pay cash to prove myself no shoplifter. Still, I abscond with my black feelings, crisp toast points dunked in fig jam. On one hand, I must think very highly of myself to come here. Then again, that sounds like something I would say. Souvenir. The glass lady doesn't know anything about Sally Hemings, except she was young and got to live in Paris for 2 years. It doesn't sound half bad, not when you think about it straight on, which nobody does. And didn't they dig up a jar of French cold cream near one of the cabins out there? The glass lady lifts candelabrum after candelabrum in the shop whose windows admit nothing but pewter sky. She could have stayed in France and been free, but instead she got right back on that ship with him. The glass lady's voice hums with a harpsichord quality. Just as she arrives at free will, she had it just like everyone. Only now I'm aware of the glass garden party hovering all around us, pearl onions, champagne, and that sharp makeup smell of grown ladies. Isn't it really to his credit that she came back here to live? I feel my champagne hatching its tiny mirrors. Perhaps it's the lady who moves me. Amid the glass faces, I lift my empty flute as if it's mine, as if I started it, as if I pulled with hot tongs a whole orchid from the air. Farm book. Whenever I write about Mr. Jefferson, he gallops over. Knock, knock, he begins, in quadruplicate. It's pretty wild, like my student's poem about a house of skin and hair, a house that bleeds. Mr. Jefferson's place is so dear to me, white husk my heart beats through until I can't write more. In my student's poem, the house stands for womanhood, pain coiled in the drywall. Sorrow warps the planks, pulling nails from ribs. In Kentucky, I'm the only Black teacher some of my students have ever met, and that pulls me somewhere. I think of Mr. Jefferson sending his field slaves to the ground, a phrase for how he made them pull tobacco and hominy from the earth, but also for how he made of the earth an oubliette. At 16, they went to the ground if Mr. Jefferson thought they couldn't learn to make nails or spin. He forgot about them until they grew into cash or more land. For him, it must have seemed like spinning, sorrow of souls forced to the ground as a way of marking off a plot. At 16, I couldn't describe the route to my own home, couldn't pilot a vehicle, could hardly tell the hour on an analog clock. I had to wear my house key on a red loop around my neck. Now I rush to class beneath a bronze Confederate, his dark obelisk, his silent mustache. My books tumble past a lectern as I recite Mr. Jefferson's litany, swan, loon, nuthatch, kingfisher. Electric web of names, yet in the ground, I know a deeper weave of gone away ones who should mean more to me than any book. I live in language on land they left. I have no language to describe this. Jason?
Hard to follow. This is a poem. The last section in my book is about last things, and they're sort of fantastical. But this is a poem about holding on to what you know is true when maybe other people don't see it. The last form. What you're describing, my teacher said, is a circle. And as they do not exist in the material realm, it is not merely foolish to think of one, but actually unethical. He explained to the class how, for tragic millennia, there were terrible time wasters known as philosophers, and how they tried to convince everyone that there were things in the world that were not in the world. Of course, they had long since been put to death, and while we kept their memory alive merely to avoid their mistakes, we should never forget at what cost we might make those mistakes as well. This was almost 60 years ago. I am an old man now, and I have fathered children, and I have worked a very long time, and I have retired. And now I tell stories to my grandchildren, and I know I am forgetting more and more. I tell myself the story of that day as a ritual to remember who I am and to fight the fog that comes. This is the one thing I have never told anyone. I still believe in the circle. I may be the last, but I believe. The next poem is called The Last Abortion. And again, set in a sort of far distant future. The Last Abortion wins the Pulitzer Prize for Columbia historian Carrie Selma, the best-selling book reminding the nation of the mostly forgotten story of how completely divided the United States had once been over a somewhat gruesome biological process rendered mercifully obsolete by the marsupial procedure over 100 years ago. Selma thrills her audience with slides from the 20th century battles, angry faces next to octagonal and circular signs, though she leaves the really gory images for an inset in the book for the truly macabre or brave. In her lectures, she mentions the antiquated phrase, the birth canal, in passing, knowing that this will be the focus of every Q&A, her audience shocked by the idea of babies as little gondolas forcing their way out of the Venice of their mothers. And I'm going to read one more before I give it back to Kiki, and this is called The Last Widow. The last widow misses men. The last widow misses her husband a great deal, but she also liked men in general. She refuses all of the invitations to appear on the morning news shows until the medical bills turn out to be more than she can swing, and she accepts the money to be interviewed. The last widow tries, this time on air, to explain that the past wasn't like what people think it was, and how now the only thing that anyone knows of men are from Victorian novels and internet pornography. People have a skewed idea of what men were like, and no, she's not saying that rape wasn't a problem, and yes, we do have more options with the wonderful things that are being done with silicone, but really, it wasn't just penises that she liked. And in fact, her husband's wasn't at all like the ones you see in the surviving documents. And really, no woman she knew behaved like the women in those videos. So can't you understand that most of the men were different too? Some of her friends suggest that she seek comfort with one of the young people who have the facial hair that's so in style now. And the last widow wants to say, I'm not a lesbian, but that word doesn't have much meaning now in a world without men. And it's not really that she wants a substitute for the husband she misses, as much as that she wishes people understood what it is that she wants back. Back to you, Kiki.
Hey, so we're almost at 30 minutes. Should we do another exchange, or I want it to be equal amounts of time?
I think one more exchange is good. Yeah. So since you started, if you want to read one more set, and then he can read one more set.
Okay, okay, I'll read one more single poem, and then I want us to end on Jason.
Okay.
Okay, thank you again so much. Read it again, and thank you, Jason, everybody who's watching. Psalm. Dear Lord, dear High Remembrancer, dear providential love, have mercy. Have mercy, thou surveyor of wildflowers, assessor of royal and exquisite bee realms. Have mercy, ledger, who tracks us in the night, who measures without speaking our dark trespasses. For nothing here survives, not the gold-legged deer browsing the bleached office park at dawn, nor the minute finch on her branch of long division, but thou, absorb it all. O gazer, be kind in thy absorbing calculus. Won't be long before thy reckoning curve arrives at the junction of our error. How, beneath thy mineral eye, we walk abroad, forgetting thee, cartographer of sparrows.
It's gorgeous. Okay, so my last poem, Fanny Imlay. Most people know who Mary Shelley is, right? That she wrote Frankenstein, and she's the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who's considered the founder of first wave feminism in the Anglophone world, and her father was William Godwin, who was a very famous philosopher. Mary Wollstonecraft had an older daughter before she died, giving birth to Mary Shelley, and her name was Fanny Imlay. And this is a poem about Fanny Imlay. In Memoriam, Fanny Imlay, 1794 to 1816. When you ask yourself how people survived the 19th century, before soap and antibiotics, before anesthesia and electricity, remember that not all of them did. Remember Fanny Imlay in her hotel room, drafting her suicide note before drinking laudanum. Remember the innkeeper who found her corpse and tore her name from the bottom of the note so she could be buried in Christian ground. Remember Fanny Imlay's final words, offering the blessing of forgetting that such a creature ever existed as I, remainder torn away.
That was so good, guys. Thank you so much. The alternating made it really a lot of fun. And it was just I could have listened to that for the rest of the hour, but I guess a conversation will be just as much fun too. So this portion of the evening is the discussion where they can talk about craft and anything like that, and we can also open it up to any audience questions. So if anybody has anything they'd like to ask, just post it in the comments and we'll address it. Is there a topic you guys wanted to start with?
Do you want to jump in? Do you want to bring something up? We have like a list. Like we did prepare.
We did. We're both thinking. We both think in part about ancestry and heritage. And I was just wondering, like, how these questions of ancestry tie into the project of Hold Me Tight, if you feel that they do directly or indirectly.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, sort of a lot of queer theory, particularly kind of like the queer communities that I came up in and a lot of the stuff I was reading was very kind of against a sort of focus on heritage, kind of against a sort of focus on the family, that the family is often a kind of damaging structure. And if you think about like Lee Edelman's No Future, which kind of talks about the child, and this is what my dissertation is about, that the child is kind of like a battering ram, sort of used to kind of exclude queer people from the public sphere. I've often kind of thought about heritage and family structures as sort of like the terrible thing that we want to get away from. And in the last 10 to 15 years, sort of with a steady increase, there's been a much greater attention to the ways in which you can't move forward unless you have an awareness of where you're coming from. And there's been a much different kind of shaping of how generational structures have kind of gotten us to where we are. And I was thinking about Joy Harjo had a piece in the New York Times talking about sort of an elder had said to her that, like the sort of the Western invasion, the European colonial invasion of the United States, and I'm going to sort of get this wrong, or what we now call the United States, is like it's just like this much, but like Native and Indigenous history is like extending your arms out, and so I've really been rethinking it. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think I felt that not having children was sort of an escape, that kind of like being not a parent, but sort of being a teacher, and then sort of having an engagement with the future through something that was extra familial, right? That was extra heritage, that was like outside of any kind of structure that's out of a bloodline, was a sort of way out. And now I have a very different sense of how the reckoning that on one hand never seems to happen in the United States, and on the other hand seems to happen every 30 years. And then there's this kind of like, there's nothing more American than amnesia, right? There's like nothing more American than sort of just like forgetting that that was there. And so I don't know, I'm in a really different, I'm in a really difficult sort of place on that, where I don't really have answers. And so I think that a lot of what's happening in Hold Me Tight, I now see a lot of those poems as refracting against ways in which we're sort of reckoning with how the past got us to the present, and the ways in which wounds that I would have thought were healing in the 90s or the 2000s or the 2010s are very far from healed, are not even close to being healed, and need to be addressed really closely. And so, I mean, I often have a very oblique structure. And I also think that being adopted changes a lot of my sort of feelings about, I mean, one of the things like we can talk about is, because you have those beautiful poems, the erasure poems about the 23andMe, and I won't do it. Like I refused, I'm a conscientious objector from 23andMe, in part because it feels like it would, I'm so used to those blanks as blanks. I'm so used to those blanks as kind of the space from which I, like what I am is the blank. Like the blank might have been painful at one point, but then the blank, that space becomes sort of like myself, right? It's almost like Freud, right? It's lost objects. That lost objects kind of like, I'm sorry, I don't want to get into Freudian object loss, but that the ego is actually populated entirely by that. And so I don't know. So I mean, I'm in this very kind of open-ended space, and I'm trying to really sort of like rethink so many things. And your book was very, very helpful in terms of doing that. In terms of thinking kind of, you know, what does it mean to be from something? What does it mean to sort of look back and be refracted in a kind of hall of mirrors? And I'll let you kind of go from there.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I'm experiencing a little bit of a delay because it just started raining here in Charlottesville, but I heard everything that Jason said, and I hope that everybody can hear me without too many weird freezes. But yeah, you know, for African Americans, for people of Americans of African descent, we often won't know much about our own ancestry, much past our grandparents. But now what's happening is that there's been a great resurgence in Black genealogy, and a lot of documents that you wouldn't think of as being informative for that search are actually very informative and are getting digitized. So I've been able to trace one particular branch of my African American family all the way to like the early 1700s. And another branch, I've hit a brick wall around 1800-ish. But even to know that much has felt like a great gift. And I did not take the 23andMe test. I took the Ancestry test DNA kit. And I did that because I wanted to know what my mixture really amounted to from the standpoint of Africa. I wanted to know what regions of Africa my DNA may have in common with people there. And I found out that you know, segments of my DNA are from various portions of Africa. But at the same time that it answered that question for me, it left more questions. It just gave rise to more questions. Like, what are the stories behind, you know, this presence of this DNA in my particular genetic code? And from what I can tell in my own research, my African ancestors came here very early. They were part of the early African American community in Virginia, which means that I have a very long heritage here, but it also means that I probably won't find a name of like the African ancestors who came from that continent to North America. So there are still lots of silences and gaps for me to work with and against. And you know, the journey of this book has been about how to classify and how to rethink the kinds of knowledge that I thought that I had about identity, and even about the processes of research.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting thing, that like how you understand heritage and how you understand identity is kind of in constant flux, right? That like it's not really something that you finish. It's not a kind of work where, you know, and I think that a lot of communities promise that. Like I think if I were if I ran over to the Hasidic community, you know, a couple neighborhoods over, and we're like, hey, I want to come back, that they would promise to tell me that, right? That they would promise to tell me exactly what it means and exactly what I need to do and exactly how I need to understand that. And I grew up with a lot of that. And in some ways, a lot of it is work that I've rejected. That you know, Judaism often has a kind of flattening of identity, that, you know, every Jew must think of himself as having been brought out of Egypt. That my Holocaust education was very much a kind of, you know, this would have happened to you had you been there, and the sort of the step to this is yours, to this happened to you, to this is, you know, is something that was really interesting to me, and that I didn't accept, that I had a really kind of fraught relationship to. Particularly as a younger Jew, when I was also very aware that if anyone knew that I was gay, that I wouldn't be welcome anymore. These were communities that were like, yeah, this is totally, you know, because most communities had this, right? That like, oh yes, like we claim you 100% unless you do that, and then we don't. And so I don't know. Do you want to talk about like how that's shifted, or like kind of where, I mean it's in the poems, and it's a little unfair to sort of ask you to explain the poems, because I mean the poems do such a beautiful job of sort of tracing that sense of encounter.
I mean, Jason, I think that belonging is always like the thing that poets long for, but our very nature as poets means that we'll never fully belong, only maybe to the extremely let's say dramatic community poets. You know, that's what we have in common, that we're all poets, right? But we also have this idea of ourselves as standing a little bit outside, like observing, thinking. Part of our brain is always moving on this other level, wondering what something might mean, what it might represent, what other thing this thing can speak to. And so I think that I accept that I will never have a 100% sense of belonging in any community. So for me, these journeys are much more about belonging to the self, or accepting one's own experience in this extremely like fraught and dangerous and very charged historical moment. I think that like probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would have resisted generalizations about all African Americans have experienced XYZ, because I always felt like my experiences were different from the African American experience that I would see on TV, or that popular culture was saying was the African American experience. But particularly in this summer of death and division, it's been really made clear to me that that this history is still happening to people of color, and the more we can talk to each other, and the more that we can try to understand each other and understand what happened before and how it connects to now, that is how we can solve problems. Like, I think that I'm a person who would advocate for truth and reconciliation in that order, and then reparation, right? Or restoration. There has to be truth. We have to know what happened. There has to be reconciliation. The injured parties and the perpetrators and oppressors have to be brought together in some way. And then there has to be restorative justice, which I learned about in Catholic school, but which now people are talking about even more. And apart from any religious like ideology, just the idea of justice that can restore is something that I really believe in.
I've been thinking a lot about how in the 90s, one of the things that defined a lot of history and philosophy following the fall of communism was kind of end of arguments. And I think the most prominent was, at the time I was working in a library, I was shelving books. The most prominent was Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, right, which is a very conservative book. And I didn't recognize that was a conservative book at the time. And I've been really shaped by Arthur Danto's The End of Art. But, there are all these books, The End of Beauty, The End of this, The End of that. And there was this very, very dominant idea in the 90s that we were at the end of history. That with the fall of communism, we now kind of live in this capitalist utopia in which we have this sort of blueprint for ever increasing promise. I mean, I remember in college, KRS-One gave a lecture in which he said that capitalism can't be racist, that basically capitalism likes money, and if Black people have the money, then, hey guys, capitalism is not racist. And I was like, that sounds, I don't, I was like, I don't think that is correct. But at the time, I didn't also have like the conceptual tools that we have now that would be much easier to kind of dismantle those sorts of arguments. But I think in the last, I think when 9/11 happened, I had this sense that we were resilient, that we could sort of get past this, that we would dig into ideals of due process and ideals of equality and ideals of shared responsibility, and it just isn't true, and we didn't. And and at this point, we are not just in the wake of history, in the way that most of our ancestors have lived, right? Not only are we in the wake of history where things change with rapid frequency, but that there's a shock to it, because and I don't think that people younger than I am have this. I think people about 5 or 10 years younger than we are don't actually share this perspective. But there was this kind of like moment of and now it's smooth sailing, boom, right? And so a lot of those rethinkings, I think in some ways have been more jarring for me than they would have been if I hadn't been sort of adolescent in a kind of end of moment. And I wanted to ask you, sorry. I wanted to ask, because we don't have kids. And I wanted to ask if you think that not having kids changes your relationship to heritage.
It's a really good question. Probably. How could it not? I mean, I do have 2 wonderful nieces and a wonderful nephew, and I love being an aunt to them. So I know that there's hopefully, there's going to be lots and lots of time for me to have a very close relationship with them and pass on some of the things that I've learned about our family. I liked what you said earlier about the idea of writing and poetry itself as having a relationship to the future. I like to think about that. I really like to think about the future, the far future, that won't have me in it, but maybe will have some glimmer of something that I wrote or something that I thought just in the air somewhere. I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't really have an answer. I know that it's possible that I could regret not having any children. But that's again a question for the future. I feel like I've reached a place of peace with it, and that appeared, it affected my writing and it affects the way that I spend my time. It's weird to be a temporal creature and to be aware of one's mortality. I don't know if I believe that having biological children is the only way to have a relationship with the future. I hope that there are other ways that I could have some kind of connection to the future. I guess I've talked about the future a lot without talking about heritage, but maybe I also think that you don't have to pass on a specific genetic code in order to contribute to the cultural heritage of your time and place, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There is a question from the audience. Isabella asks, what's the last poem you read that you were the most excited about?
I was reading this book by an author named Layla Chatty called Deluge, and I was just like, these are amazing. And it was a first book, and it's incredibly formally innovative. And I don't have like one particular poem in place, but there was one poem in which, you know how when you're doing, it's like kids do it where they have the dots and the dots are numbered when you connect the dots. I guess that's what it's called. It's called a connect the dots. I don't have children. It's been 30 years. When you connect the dots, you make a picture. There was a poem like that where the numbers, you had to read through the numbers, and it was the most formally, and it was, you know, a lot of people are doing a lot of formally innovative things and are playing with the page. And this was just like, it was really exciting. Like I was like, I get to read in this like field that's been guided in this way that I have not done before. And that was exciting. Layla Chatty, Deluge.
Yeah, my experience was similar to Jason's. Layli Long Soldier is a Native American poet who's working on, it seems like a series of concrete poems. And by that, I mean that they're meant to take the shape of something. They're kind of diamond-shaped poems that I think she's calling them obligations. Some of them have reached social media. So I've had a chance to read them, and you can kind of like, you can read all, you know, traditionally across this diamond shape, or you can read vertically, or the poem also makes syntactical sense if you read like in a jagged way across this shape.
Wow.
So it trains your eye to read in a different way. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, I've read her book Whereas, and it's, you know, amazing. And I think Ocean Vuong has a poem that has like the footnotes on the page, and then you follow the footnotes down. So that's the closest connection I have to the connect the dots. But that sounds really cool. What other books would you guys recommend that people read right now?
I just read Jake Skeet's Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers, and I thought that was really amazing. I was just really the town that's conjured. I haven't had this feeling since I read Arturo Riley's Romy's Order, which is a book that I really love. But Jake Skeets just builds this whole world that you're inside of, and it's very gently. And it gently is not to suggest that it's not violent or sexual or, you know, like a lot of other things, but like it's so gently sketched. And it was such a kind of, I know we usually use the word world building for like, you know, Harry Potter and things like that. But I was just absolutely struck by how completely I felt I had entered the space that he was conjuring in that book.
So my suggestion is not a book of poetry. It's actually a history book, and it's Annette Gordon Reed's The Hemmingses of Monticello. It is a wonderful treatment and portrait of the Hemmings family in the context of Monticello. A lot of it has to do with the 18th century and how people of various racial backgrounds interacted in the space of a plantation like Monticello, and it gives you a richer sense of like how Jefferson moved in that world, and how and why he made some of the decisions that he made. You know, he had a white family and he also had a black family. How did those two families, who were aware of one another, interact? How did they even come to be, and what happened? It's an amazing book that reads it. The language reads so much like a novel, or just the richest piece of nonfiction that you can read. I've read it cover to cover twice, and I just highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you.
I will also recommend, and I'm going to get the title wrong because I always use the wrong verb, but it's Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawler. And I mean, one, it was set in the 90s, so anyone who lived through the 90s, you'll get to use all of your references to bands that no one remembers, like Belly and L7 and, you know, everything that was on the radio when you're in high school. but it's fantastic. It's about the main character can change his body, sort of genderly, and encounters other people who have similar abilities in the same realm, in different realms. And it was just like, I mean, one, it was a fantastic novel. I was absolutely thrilled and totally compelled. And like, usually I don't like road novels, and where someone goes from like one coast to the next coast and back. And I was like, like I couldn't put it down. But also just like it felt so necessary. It felt like it gave me all of this, like kind of, it gave me a lot of ways to think about embodiment that I needed.
Did you have any more, Kiki, that you wanted to recommend?
Yes, I'm going to turn here to my bookshelf because I'm teaching this actually this fall. This is Koya Fagan Maple's Mend. It is from the University Press of Kentucky, and it's a series of poems that are about crimes committed against African American women's bodies. Like there was a doctor in the 19th century who experimented on the bodies of African American women, and his work led to, essentially, he's basically the father of modern gynecology, but he arrived at that position in history through atrocity. So these poems speak in the voices of some of those women. And we're going to read that in a class called Time Travel for Poets here at the University of Virginia. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about the ethics of persona and the techniques that this very talented poet has used in this book.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. We still have some time left, so if you guys want to talk more about a topic, maybe about the ethics of persona, like you both put yourself in the eyes of other characters in both of your poems. You could engage with that if you wanted.
Well,
yeah, Jason,
I find. Go ahead.
When I was writing this book, I told myself that I didn't want to write in persona because I didn't want to assume the voices of people who didn't have a voice historically or in the historical record. So there are very few instances of persona. And there are some cases where I speak in the voice of my own ancestors, but I use we rather than I, which I feel adds more of an oracular or like mysterious sense to the we. But how do you feel about it, Jason?
Well, I was gonna say, because in your poems, I didn't have a sense of persona in White Blood. Like I had a very, very strong sense of it being you. And poets often get it, that's day one, right? Don't conflate the speaker with the poet. But we also do when we do. And I would definitely agree with you that I think that it's often quite ethically problematic to assume voices of the dead. Although there are certainly, like, I is the master of that, right? Like I's poems, where she kind of like goes right into these historical figures, and it's unbelievably powerful. I started using persona as kind of an asbestos gloves. Like, I mean, if you looked at my like undergraduate thesis, or if you looked at kind of the poems I was writing in graduate school, they were mostly about characters, about mythological characters, about historical characters, about biblical characters, characters that I kind of felt there was enough space that I could kind of work into, characters that I felt would be familiar already, so I didn't have to do storytelling. I could kind of get right to monologue. And then I think as I developed as a poet, I became a little more comfortable speaking as myself. And I'm always kind of interested, because I think most of us as poets kind of like have a little, like, we're not memoirists, we're not novelists. Like, we have a little wiggle room where we can sort of, we can bring in a little persona when we want to, or we can kind of leave out a little persona when we don't. When my first book came out, my older brother, and how do you know that your family actually reads your poetry? They tell you what's wrong in it. And so my older brother said, when you were 11, I didn't tell you that gullible means how strong you are. I told you that gullible is a sum total of your positive qualities. And I was like, I know, but it's a poem, not a memoir. I'm allowed to, like, it's scanned better. I'm allowed to get that in there. And so persona, as poetry, I think persona can be a really powerful tool that kind of gives you a sort of like simultaneous distance and immediacy. But you do also have to be really careful because there is kind of a line you don't want to cross. And those lines shift. I mean, Ed Hirsch at NYU is very critical of Sylvia Plath for the way that she uses, the World War II, when she says, I think I may be a bit of a Jew. Do you, Sylvia? Right? I mean, like we wouldn't do that now. Or if you did, Twitter would have something to say. But those lines are kind of constantly redrawn, and we need what we get out of it, but we also have to be really careful because the work that it does is so powerful.
Well, thank you guys both for joining us tonight. It was so much fun to listen to your conversations and the way that your poems also work in conversation. If anybody watching wants any of your books, all 8 of them you can get through our website, or call us, or go to your local indie bookstore. And I guess,
are you guys open again? Are you actually like?
Yes.
Can you go in?
You can go in as long as you have a mask.
Wear a mask.
Use the hand sanitizer at the front door. But yes, you can come in.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Well, everybody, have a good night. Thank you for joining us. Bye.